January 1946. A British soldier stood before 200 terrified German women prisoners. His order was simple but chilling: sleep without your clothes tonight. Hearts stopped. Hands trembled. Many clutched hidden poison pills, ready to choose death over what they believed was coming. But what happened next would shatter every warning they'd been given. Subscribe now to hear this incredible true story. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. It was January 1946. The war had ended 8 months ago. But for 200 German women sitting in a cold British camp in Norfolk, England, the nightmare was just beginning. The British soldier stood at the entrance of their wooden barracks. He was young, maybe 24 years old. His face showed no emotion. The winter sun was weak and cold behind him. He spoke 6 words that made every woman's heart stop. Sleep without your clothes tonight. The room went silent. 200 women stopped breathing. Some grabbed their blankets tighter. Others looked at each other with wide, terrified eyes. Their commanders had warned them about this moment. They had prepared them for the worst. Many of these women carried hidden cyanide pills in their uniform collars, ready to choose death over what they believed was coming. The propaganda they had been fed painted a terrifying picture of what British soldiers would do to captured German women. But what actually happened that night would shatter everything they believed. It would challenge every warning they had received. And it would change their lives forever in ways they could never have imagined. Before we continue this story, please subscribe to our channel. We share true historical stories like this every day. Hit the subscribe button so you never miss these incredible true accounts. Now, back to our story. The temperature outside was freezing. Inside the wooden barracks, it was not much warmer. The walls were thin. The wind came through the cracks. These women had been cold for months, maybe years. Their bodies had forgotten what warmth felt like. Their fingers were permanently stiff from the cold. Their feet ached constantly. But the physical cold was nothing compared to the ice-cold fear now gripping their hearts. Hilda was 25 years old. She had been a radio operator in the German military. The British captured her only 1 week ago. She stood by her narrow bed, her mind racing with terrible thoughts. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She tried to steady her breathing but could not. She remembered the warnings. German officers had told them what would happen if they were captured. The enemy will hurt you, they said with absolute certainty. The British soldiers are cruel. They will not treat you like human beings. They will do terrible things to you at night. If you are captured, you know what you must do. The message was clear: death was preferable to capture. Hilda looked at the young British guard again. He was not drunk. He was not laughing with his friends. He was not looking at the women in a bad way. Instead, he was busy with strange equipment outside the barracks. His movements were methodical, professional, almost mechanical. There was no emotion on his face. No cruelty. But also no kindness, just cold efficiency. There were large metal containers. There were pipes and machinery. Strange valves and gauges. The equipment looked industrial, like something from a factory. It reminded Hilda of the terrible stories she had heard about gas chambers. Stories whispered among soldiers about the camps. About systematic killing, about industrial death. Her hands started shaking even more violently. This was it, she thought. This was how they would die. These 200 German women were prisoners of war. They were between 18 and 45 years old. They came from different parts of Germany. Some had been soldiers. Some had been nurses. Some had worked in communications or supply units. Some had been teachers and factory workers before the war drafted them into service. They had different backgrounds, different educations, different lives before the war. But now they shared the same fate. The same fear. The same terrible anticipation of what was coming. Before they were captured, 73 of these women had been given something terrible. Small pills, poison pills. Cyanide capsules hidden in their uniform collars or pockets. Tiny pills that could end a life in seconds, pills that represented the final escape, the final choice, the final control over their own fate. Their commanders told them, if the enemy captures you, take the pill. Death is better than what they will do to you. Death is honorable. Capture is shame. Your family will understand. Your country will honor you as a hero who chose death over dishonor. 2 women had already used their pills. They chose death over capture. They swallowed the cyanide within minutes of seeing British soldiers approaching. They died quickly, their bodies found later by the advancing troops. Their families back in Germany were told that their daughters died fighting bravely in combat. Nobody would ever know the truth. Nobody would ever know they had taken their own lives out of fear. The other 71 women still had their pills hidden. Or so they thought. They touched their collars constantly, feeling for the small hard shape sewn into the fabric. The pills were their insurance policy. Their escape route, their final power in a powerless situation. Anna was only 19 years old. She had worked as an auxiliary helper, bringing supplies to soldiers. She was young and scared. She kept touching the collar of her uniform where her small pill was sewn into the fabric. They will hurt us, Anna whispered to the woman next to her. This is what we were warned about. The woman next to her was Margaret. She was 33 years old and spoke both German and English. She had worked as an interpreter. Margaret was trying to understand what the British soldier was saying. Private Davies was the name of the British Guard. He was from London. He was carefully setting up the strange equipment outside the main door of the barracks. More British soldiers arrived. They started sealing the windows. They installed machinery near the entrance. But none of them came inside the barracks. They stayed outside. This made the women even more scared. Why the careful preparation? What were they planning? Margaret translated Private Davies's words to the other women. The procedure will begin at 9 p.m. tonight. It will last for 7 hours. You must follow all instructions exactly. 7 hours. The whole night. The women looked at each other. Some started crying quietly. Others wrote quick letters to their families, hiding the papers under their thin mattresses. Each woman stood next to her small bed. Their uniforms were dirty and torn. They had been wearing the same clothes for months. The fabric was thin and full of holes. But these uniforms were all they had. Now they were told to take them off. Hilda had been trained as a field medic before becoming a radio operator. She had seen wounded soldiers die. She had seen terrible things during the war. But nothing prepared her for this moment. She touched the small dark pill hidden in her collar. It would be quick, she thought. She would not feel pain. It would be an honorable death, better than what was coming. Private Davies and the other British soldiers checked their equipment. A strange steam started coming from the machines. The smell was sharp and chemical. It smelled like disinfectant, like the chemicals used in hospitals. The British Guard started backing away from the building. They put on heavy rubber masks that covered their faces. This is it, Hilda thought. This is the gas. This is how we die. The British soldiers moved with cold efficiency. They did not make jokes. They did not drink alcohol. They did not look at the women with cruel eyes. They were professional and systematic. Somehow, this made it worse. If they were drunk and out of control, it might end quickly. But this was planned. This was organized. Systems like this do not stop. Every woman prepared herself mentally. They had 2 choices, take the pill and die quickly, or wait and see what the British would do to them. The folded uniforms on the floor looked like white flags of surrender. Like burial shrouds. But then Margaret noticed something strange. The British guards outside were taking off their own uniforms too. In the freezing cold, they were stripping down to their underclothes. They threw their heavy coats and battle uniforms into the same metal containers. Why would they do that? Margaret thought. Why would attackers delouse themselves? The word delouse suddenly appeared in her mind. But she pushed it away. No, it could not be that simple. The German commanders had been very clear. The British would attack them. The British would hurt them. Always. No exceptions. The guards finished their preparations. They sealed the doors from the outside. The metal bolts slammed shut. The women were locked in. The steam started pouring through the vents in the walls. The 7 hours began. Every German woman in that barracks had received the same training. The same warnings, the same terrible predictions. The British will abuse you, then they will kill you. There are no exceptions. Your honor must not survive your body. Choose the pill. But something was wrong. The smell was not poison gas. Hilda knew the smell of poison gas from medical training. This was different. It was DDT. A powerful insecticide. Hilda had smelled DDT before in field hospitals on the Eastern Front. It was used to kill insects. To kill lice. To prevent disease. Why would the British use DDT on their prisoners? Why would they sanitize their enemies? For what purpose? Ruth was 29 years old. She had been a schoolteacher before the war. She reached up to touch her collar where her pill had been hidden. But the pill was gone. Then she remembered. When the British first captured them, they had done a thorough search. They called the pills suicide contraband. They took them away from every woman they found them on. The British seemed genuinely confused by the pills. As if the idea of suicide was strange to them. Ruth suddenly realized the truth. The British had taken away 71 pills during the intake searches. Only 2 women had used their pills before capture. The rest of the women in this barracks had no pills at all. They could not choose death even if they wanted to. The steam filled the barracks quickly. It was hot and thick with chemicals. But it brought something else too, warmth. Real warmth. For the first time in weeks, the women felt warm air on their skin. The temperature in the barracks started to rise. Their frozen bodies slowly relaxed. Through the moisture-covered windows, Margaret watched the British soldiers outside. They were shivering in the January cold, wearing only their thin underclothes. Private Davies was operating the equipment, completely exposed to the freezing wind. Then Margaret saw something that changed everything. Lice, millions of them, dead. Falling from the wooden walls like black snow. Falling from the ceiling. Falling from their own threadbare uniforms. The women had lived with lice for so long that they forgot what it felt like to be clean. The constant itching had become normal. The persistent low fever was just part of life. The weakness and exhaustion were blamed on hunger. But it was not just hunger. It was parasites. Tiny insects living in their clothes, in their hair, on their skin, feeding on their blood, breeding, spreading, slowly killing them. Anna unconsciously scratched the angry red marks on her arms. She had these marks for months. She thought it was from the cold. Or from stress. She never realized it was from lice bites. Through the thick steam, the women watched something shocking. The British guards were burning their own uniforms. Actual flames. They were destroying their own clothing. These were not rich men. These were ordinary soldiers. A uniform was expensive. It represented their rank, their identity, their livelihood. But they were burning everything. There was no rank distinction in front of the delousing equipment. Officers and privates all threw their uniforms into the fire. The lice did not care about rank. The disease did not check passports. Gazella was 23 years old. She had worked in a factory before joining the military. For the past 2 days, she had been delirious with fever. She could barely stand. She thought it was hunger and cold. But it was not. It was the early stage of typhus. A deadly disease spread by lice. The barracks temperature climbed higher. It reached 35 degrees Celsius, about 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Bodies that had forgotten warmth suddenly remembered what it felt like to be comfortable. Muscles relaxed. Fear fought against physical relief. This did not match the propaganda. This did not match the warnings. Why would enemies treat them like human beings worthy of rescue? Ruth started to take off her uniform. It was heavy with 6 months of accumulated dirt and sweat. It had never been washed. Looking at it now, she felt ashamed. She had thought wearing the same uniform was a sign of strength and endurance. Now she realized it was just stupidity. Other women slowly followed. Their eyes were still suspicious. But the warmth and the chemicals were killing the real enemy. The lice. The British guards were not watching them. They were not entering the barracks. They were not celebrating. They were freezing outside, destroying their own possessions to stop the disease from spreading. Margaret saw the complete truth when a British medical officer appeared at the sealed window. Dr. Harrington was 42 years old. He held up large photographs to the window so the women inside could see. The photographs showed lice magnified many times. They showed bacteria. They showed the progression of typhus disease. The statistics written on the photographs were devastating. Over 90% of the POW population was infested with lice. Typhus had a 20% mortality rate. The disease had a 14-day incubation period. By the time symptoms appeared, it was too late to stop without immediate action. "We thought it was torture," whispered Hannelore. She was 27 years old, a surgical nurse. She was pulling hundreds of dead lice from her own hair. Each tiny insect had been feeding on her blood. Each one could carry the typhus bacteria. The German military had known about the lice problem. They had known about typhus. But they did nothing. They prioritized ideology and propaganda over medicine. They never admitted that German soldiers were dying more from lice than from Allied bullets. Dr. Harrington's photographs showed the grim progression clearly: first, high fever. Then, a telltale rash spreading across the chest and back, then delirium and confusion, then death. He made sure every woman understood through Margaret's translation. This was not punishment. This was not torture. This was a desperate act of salvation from a plague they were already carrying in their clothes and hair. The steam continued to fill every corner of the barracks. DDT powder fell like heavy snow from the vents. The chemical sting in their nostrils was uncomfortable, but it was a minor pain compared to the realization of what the chemicals were actually doing. They were killing the things that had been silently weakening the women for months. Preparing them for typhus, preparing them for death. The disinfectant worked systematically through the barracks. Lice eggs in the seams of clothing, adult insects living in hair, larvae hiding in fabric folds, all of them dying. The floor of the barracks turned black. A carpet of dead parasites covered every surface. Generations of lice, an empire of disease, being wiped out in one night. Anna suddenly vomited. Not from the chemicals, but from the realization. Her weakness over the past weeks, her feverish confusion, the strange rash on her back. It was the beginning of typhus. The disease had been growing stronger every day inside her body. Without this treatment, she would have died within a week. The women stripped completely. Shame died in the face of survival. Either the lice had to die, or the women would. The equation was that simple. The British understood this. The German command had ignored it. Hilda's medical training suddenly took over. She started looking at the other women with a doctor's eyes instead of a prisoner's fear. She saw the early symptoms everywhere. Gazella's fever and confusion, early typhus Rutha's spreading rash, typhus Margaret's strange exhaustion, typhus at least 30 other women showing signs. All of them treatable now, in the early stages, all of them fatal within days without intervention. The British Guards stayed outside all night. Freezing. Burning everything they owned, including their dignity. But saving their enemies from an invisible death, from a preventable plague, from the cold neglect of their own military. 7 hours of steam. 7 hours of chemicals. 7 hours of killing what was slowly killing the women. The guards worked through the entire night, racing against the epidemic. They moved from one barracks to another, treating every prisoner the same way. Inside the barracks, something unexpected happened. The women started helping each other. They checked each other's backs for lice. They picked through each other's hair. They killed manually what the chemicals might have missed. Cooperation was born from understanding. Enemy helping enemy to survive a mutual threat. A threat that cared nothing for politics or nationality. When morning finally came, the women found something waiting beside their beds that made many of them weep. Fresh uniforms. Clean, deloused, pressed, and mended. Hilda touched the fabric with trembling fingers. The cotton was surprisingly soft. No lice. No blood stains. No 6 months of accumulated grime and sweat. Someone had washed these uniforms. Someone had pressed them carefully. Someone had mended the tears and replaced missing buttons. Hours of work on enemy clothing, done by British hands. Captain Wilson was 45 years old. He was the camp administrator. He came to the barracks that morning to explain what had happened. Through Margaret's translation, he shared the facts. The Geneva Convention, Article 27, requires the protection of women prisoners' dignity and health. Since the opening of British POW camps, there had been 0 reported assaults on female prisoners. 0. We were the savages, Ruth whispered, holding her freshly cleaned uniform in her hands. The British were following rules that Germany never acknowledged. Rules that Germany violated every single day with its own prisoners. Each uniform showed careful repairs. Buttons had been replaced. Tears had been painstakingly mended. Someone had spent hours working on the clothing of their enemies. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Enemies do not mend enemy clothes. But these enemies did. The morning sun came through the windows, which had also been cleaned by the steam. The barracks looked transformed. It was habitable now. Even dignified. Anna reached into her pocket and found something that made her cry. A small chocolate bar. A British military ration. 2 ounces of pure sugar and cocoa. In starving Germany, this was a fortune. She checked with the other women. Every single woman had chocolate in her pocket. Every uniform pocket contained a small bar. The chocolate had been purchased with the guards' personal wages. Some wrappers had signatures on them. Private Davies. Private Smith. They had spent their own money, their own food rations, on their enemies. The women dressed slowly. The clean fabric felt alien against their skin. It was almost too generous for prisoners. Too human for enemies. Some women wept as they put on underwear that was free of lice. A simple dignity that a forgotten sensation of being clean. Captain Wilson explained further, every prisoner receives this treatment. Male or female, officer or enlisted. The lice don't discriminate. Neither does typhus. Neither do we. But the women's tears were not just from relief. They were from shame. Deep, crushing shame. They had believed the poison of propaganda over the clear evidence before their eyes. They had feared assault more than disease. They had been ready to die rather than trust the British. They had almost died from simple ignorance and pride. Gazella's fever broke overnight. The delousing had stopped the typhus progression just in time. She would live. Saved by the very enemies her own army had abandoned to die from parasites. Ruth started writing frantically in a small notebook she had hidden. She was documenting everything. The psychological warfare of it all. How do you process enemies who clean your clothes? Who share their chocolate? Who treat you with basic humanity that your own commanders never offered? Who follow international rules you were taught did not exist? The simple, clean, pressed uniform waiting on the bed was more than fabric. It was a symbol of dignity restored, of humanity returned, of everything propaganda swore was impossible. Hilda found something tucked into her uniform pocket that should not have been there. A chocolate bar with a small handwritten note, "Stay strong. D. 2 ounces of chocolate." That represented a week's worth of sugar rations in Germany, if you could even find sugar at all. The Allies produced billions of these ration bars. Billions. The number was incomprehensible to the starving German mind. The industrial capacity that could make billions of chocolate bars while fighting a war on multiple continents. Private Davies entered the barracks carrying a tray. Steaming coffee. Real Brazilian coffee beans, not the burnt grain substitute the Germans had been drinking for years. The steam rose from the metal cups. He served his enemies like they were guests. This was the paradox that destroyed everything they had believed. Everything they had been prepared to die to prevent. Davies explained the true emergency through Margaret's translation. A massive typhus outbreak had struck the main men's POW camp 3 days ago. 3 prisoners had already died. Dozens more were in critical condition. The disease was spreading exponentially. The women's camp was next in line for treatment. It was considered the most vulnerable because women's longer hair provided more hiding places for lice. The British had worked 20 straight hours. Barracks to barracks, prisoner to prisoner, racing against an epidemic that was not even their fault. These were German lice on German prisoners. But now they were a British responsibility because the British had captured these prisoners. The chocolate melted on tongues and used to sweetness. The coffee burned throats and used to heat. The kindness hurt more than cruelty would have. Because cruelty would have confirmed the propaganda. Kindness demolished it completely. Davies confirmed that all the chocolate, coffee, soap, and cigarettes in their pockets had been bought with the guards' personal wages. Personal sacrifices for enemies who had expected death. Anna, the 19-year-old who had carried a cyanide capsule in her collar, now shared her chocolate with Gisela, who was still weak but alive. A measurable, irreversible transformation was happening. The chocolate wrapper crinkled in Anna's hand. British milk chocolate. A symbol of industrial abundance. Of winning not just through destruction, but through production. Ruth documented every detail in her notebook. The cleaning, the delousing, the chocolate, the coffee. Evidence that would not be believed back home in Germany. Families would not want to hear that their enemies were humane. That their own commanders had been cruel through neglect. But in this moment, the chocolate dissolved barriers. The coffee bridged the trenches between enemies. Humanity transcended the colors of their uniforms. The guards were not monsters. The women were not just victims. They were all human beings sharing sugar and caffeine on a cold January morning. 3 days later, Hilda's strength had fully returned. The lice were gone. The typhus had been prevented. The chocolate was a memory that gave her strength. She made a decision that could have easily led to a bullet. She approached Captain Wilson with a request, "Let me help." She pointed toward the medical tents in the distance. The camp hospital was overwhelmed with wounded prisoners and exhausted staff struggling to keep up. Major Cooper was 43 years old. He was in charge of the medical services. He looked at Hilda's uniform and saw her medical insignia. He saw his own exhausted medical staff. He saw the arithmetic. 60 wounded prisoners. 12 nurses. Not enough. He knew from captured German files that 47 of the women prisoners were trained medical personnel. Nurses, medics, surgical assistants. Hilda had surgical certification. Hannelore was a trauma specialist with 3 years of experience on the Eastern Front. Ruth had medical training that was desperately needed. Healing knows no flag, Major Cooper said. Hannelore immediately volunteered. She was a surgical nurse who had treated hundreds of wounded soldiers on the Eastern Front. Blood had taught her that all humans are equal in their need for care. Within minutes, 31 more women raised their hands. They wanted to volunteer. The debt of the chocolate, the gift of the delousing. The humanity they had been shown. It was time for repayment through service. Through healing. Cooper hesitated. There were regulations. Security concerns. Politics. But the wounded kept arriving. Young British soldiers bleeding, German prisoners dying. The mathematics overrode politics. Need transcended nationalism. Within 1 week, all 47 trained medical personnel were working. They wore British medical coats over their German uniforms. They were distinguished only by the International Red Cross armbands on their sleeves. The contradiction was visible. The necessity was obvious. Enemies treating enemies, healers healing. Hilda's first patient was a 19-year-old British private from Yorkshire. He had a deep infected wound in his stomach. The kind she had treated hundreds of times during the war. Her hands remembered the motions. Scalpel, forceps, sutures, muscle memory transcended politics and nationality. The surgical light burned bright above the operating table. The antiseptic was sharp in her nose. Blood was the universal color of urgency. The young British soldier opened his eyes after the surgery. He saw a German nurse standing over him. He whispered one word, thanks. An effort made through pain to show gratitude. Anna, too young for full nursing duties, trained as a surgical assistant. She held instruments, comforted the wounded, and translated between German and English when needed. German words, British wounds, human suffering without nationality. Major Cooper watched, stunned. These enemy prisoners worked harder than some of his own staff. They took longer shifts. They were more careful and precise. They were proving something to the British, to themselves, to the watching world. Healers transcend hatred. Margaret used her language skills to translate technical terms. Morphine dosages, infection protocols, surgical procedures. Language barriers dissolved in medical urgency. Pain speaks all languages. The German nurses worked 16-hour shifts voluntarily. They were not paid beyond their regular rations. But they were restored to purpose. They were not prisoners anymore. Not enemies. They were nurses. Healers, humans with skills saving other humans. Ruth treated German prisoners alongside British soldiers. No distinction in care. No favoritism. Blood is blood. Medicine is medicine. The transformation was complete. Women who had expected assault were now saving lives. Guards who could have abused them were now protecting them. Enemies had become colleagues. But when new German prisoners began arriving, the fragile structure was threatened. An officer named Vera arrived as a prisoner. He was 38 years old. He had been captured just yesterday along with 2,000 other German officers. He was still wearing his military insignia. Still clinging to the belief in final victory. Vera entered the medical tent and saw Hilda treating a British soldier. "Traitor," he shouted. The word was like a piece of shrapnel cutting through the air. The medical tent froze. Every German woman stopped working. Every British guard tensed. Vera's authority radiated threat even though he was a prisoner. The conditioning ran deep in these women. Officers command. Others obey or die. After the war, we will settle accounts, Vera said, his voice cold. He spat on the medical tent floor where German nurses were saving British lives. He vowed retribution for those who chose healing over hatred. Every woman heard the threat. When the British eventually left Germany, when Germany rebuilt after defeat, there would be lists. Traitors would be punished. Collaborators would face justice. Colonel Mitchell was 44 years old. He intervened immediately. He physically stepped between Vera and the nurses. Geneva Convention requires separation by sex, Mitchell said firmly. Male prisoners will be relocated immediately. The male POWs were moved to a different camp within the hour. Vera never came near the hospital again. Hilda never stopped suturing during the confrontation. British blood needed to be stopped from flowing. German hands continued healing. The oath she had taken as a nurse predated the Nazi regime. Predated Vera, predated the war. Hippocrates over Hitler. Vera's shouts about racial betrayal and coming punishment faded into the distance. But the threat lingered like poison in the air. 2,000 German officers were now in the camp. 0 were allowed near the hospital. The British enforcement was absolute. They were protecting the German nurses from the German military. The irony was sharp and obvious. Anna, who had been raised to fear and obey officers, now saved the lives of men Vera wished dead. Mitchell documented everything. Vera's threats, names, dates, evidence for future war crimes trials, evidence for the women's protection. History had inverted itself. The British military was protecting German women from the German military. The medical tent returned to its work. But it was changed. Every woman knew she had chosen a side. Healing over hatred, life over death, future over past. Some would pay for this choice. But tonight, wounds needed cleaning. Lives needed saving. Patients needed care. The war would end in 4 more months. But for these women, the real battle was just beginning. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, repatriation began. The process of sending prisoners back to their home countries. Then the letters started arriving. Letters from families in Germany. Letters that destroyed any remaining hope these women had. Margaret's husband wrote 3 sentences: "You lived. You helped the enemy. Do not return." 20 years of marriage ended in 3 sentences. The statistics were brutal. 34% of female POWs were rejected by their families. 200 women applied for Allied employment rather than return home. 400 eventually immigrated to Britain and the Commonwealth. The mathematics of rejection. Better dead than dishonored, Anna's mother wrote to her 19-year-old daughter who had saved countless lives. Her family chose ideology over their own child. Lieutenant Shaw was 30 years old. She processed immigration papers for the rejected women. British hospitals desperately needed nurses after the war. Sponsors were available. Jobs were waiting. A future was possible for these German outcasts. Britain was taking what Germany discarded. Hilda's brother declared her officially dead to their neighbors back home. It was easier than explaining her survival and her choice to help the enemy. Ruth's husband had remarried, thinking she was dead. Her return would be inconvenient. The rejection letter was cold and final. The rejections piled up daily in Lieutenant Shaw's office. But for each rejection, she had a stamp ready. British visas. Work permits. New identities. Each stamp rejected the rejection. Each signature offered a fresh start. Hannelore signed her immigration papers first. Germany offered only shame. Britain offered work and dignity. She was leaving the homeland that did not want her for the enemy nation that did. Anna was only 19. She was too young to immigrate alone. She needed a family sponsor. A Methodist family in Yorkshire had lost their son in Normandy during the invasion. They agreed to sponsor Anna, the young German girl who had helped save British soldiers. Their loss became her grace. Their grief transformed into compassion. Some women chose to stay. They were determined to face the hatred. To rebuild Germany. To show Vera was wrong. To prove that survival was not shameful. The barracks slowly emptied. Women scattered across the globe. Some to Britain, some to Canada, some to Australia. Some back to Germany to face uncertain futures. 20 years passed. Time softened some memories. Shame transformed into understanding for some, hardened into bitterness for others. Munich, Germany. Hilda returned to Germany wearing something utterly unexpected. British Red Cross insignia on her uniform. She was 44 years old now. A British resident. A medical advisor teaching German nurses modern British medical techniques. The woman Germany had rejected was now helping rebuild German healthcare. Private Davies visited Munich that same year. He was retired now, wearing civilian clothes. His hair was grey. But he still brought chocolate. English chocolate bars. 20 years later, the same gesture, humanity transcending time. Forgive me. The words came from a hospital bed. Vera, the officer who had called them traitors, was dying of cancer. He was begging for mercy from the women he had condemned. Statistics of transformation. 400 former POWs became British residents, 89 worked in Commonwealth hospitals, 12 returned to help rebuild German healthcare. Hilda checked Vera's medical charts. Professional, thorough, the same oath she had kept when he demanded betrayal 20 years ago. Vera's skeletal hand reached out to her. Desperate, dying, ideology was meaningless against cancer. Hilda took his hand. Checked his pulse, adjusted his medication. The healer transcended everything, even old hatred. Anna wrote letters from Yorkshire regularly. She was married now. A schoolteacher. 3 children. The 19-year-old girl who had been told to die rather than surrender was now teaching life to young British children. She sent medical supplies to German orphanages regularly. Paying forward the chocolate and kindness she had received 20 years ago. Margaret was now the head nurse at a major Munich hospital. She was training younger women. Teaching them that survival is not shameful. That healing transcends politics. The hospital ward now held former officers like Vera receiving care from the women they had once condemned. Ruth still documented everything. Writing for history. Writing for proof that humanity can survive its own worst instincts. Her notebooks filled thousands of pages over the years. Detailed accounts, photographs, letters, evidence that this incredible transformation had actually happened, evidence that enemies could become friends. That hatred could transform into healing. The stethoscope was cold against Vera's chest. His heart was failing. The cancer was winning. His breathing was shallow and labored. His skin was pale and waxy. He had maybe days left, perhaps only hours. But Hilda held his hand anyway. The woman he had called a traitor was now comforting him in his final moments. The British resident helping the German officer die with dignity. Administering morphine for his pain, adjusting his pillows, speaking softly to him in German. Treating him with the same care she gave every patient. The healer transcends everything. Even old hatred, even betrayal, even condemnation. Davies and Hilda drank coffee together in the hospital cafeteria. Real coffee. Just like 20 years ago. The taste brought back memories. The cold barracks. The steam, the fear that transformed into understanding. The moment everything changed. Once they were enemy and prisoner. Then they became friends. Now they were connected by chocolate, by shared history, by choosing healing over hatred. Connected by a night in January 1946 that neither would ever forget. A night that changed hundreds of lives. A night that proved humanity could survive even in the darkest circumstances. The folded uniform now sits in a museum in London. A clean, pressed symbol of transformation. Of dignity preserved. Of enemies becoming human. Of propaganda dying while people lived. A small card next to the uniform tells the story. 6 words that terrified 200 women: sleep without your clothes tonight. What followed? Steam, not assault; chocolate, not cruelty. Healing, not hatred. Proving that humanity can survive even humanity's worst demands. The chocolate wrapper is also in the museum display. Crinkled and faded. Stay strong. D. Still visible in faded ink. 2 ounces that changed everything. The story reminds us that enemies are made by politics and propaganda. But humans remain human underneath the uniforms. The British Guards did not have to care. They could have followed the example set by others. They could have turned away. But they chose humanity. They chose the difficult path. They spent their own money. They froze in the cold. They burned their own uniforms. They worked through the night. Not for glory. Not for thanks. But because it was right. And 200 women who expected death received life instead.